Star Trek V: The Final Frontier is directed by Captain Kirk himself, William Shatner, written by David Lowery, and stars the usual crew of the Enterprise plus Lawrence Luckinbill. And in Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, the crew of the Enterprise encounter a rogue Vulcan called Sybok who wants control over the ship in order to travel to the planet Shakari and meet God, whom Sybok believes is located there. As I've said before, a lot of people like saying that all the odd-numbered Star Trek movies are bad. I don't necessarily believe this because, you know, the first movie isn't good, but I do kind of enjoy it. And while Star Trek 3 really is not very good either, I still don't think it's a bad movie. Star Trek 5, however, is really the Star Trek movie that is quite bad. In my opinion, The Final Frontier really kind of represents the worst things that the original series had. On a sort of positive note, it does feature the triumphant return of composer Jerry Goldsmith to the series. However, overall, it just has such a horrible story and some of the most embarrassing attempts at humor I think I've ever seen in a movie. The first thing Star Trek V gets wrong, in my opinion, is the fact that it just doesn't feel connected to the previous films. And I understand that Star Trek by its very nature is episodic. However, the thing that made the older Star Trek movies special is the fact that, you know, Star Trek 2 until 4 really were one complete arc. Here you really feel that it's not connected to the other films because it doesn't feel like the character development has been carried over. They make a couple of references to Wrath of Khan, which is really weird, but that doesn't really play into the story. And that's kind of disappointing because the main plot in Final Frontier does have a lot of potential with, you know, this whole spiritual aspect that had never been really explored before in the Star Trek films. However, the themes here just go absolutely nowhere. You never really get to, you know, go in depth about all this spiritual stuff, and that's kind of weird because, you know, if Star Trek gets criticized for something, it's usually for its lack of action, not its shallow treatment of its themes. Here, it doesn't do either very well at all. And much of that has to do with the fact that the character of Sybok is just such an uninteresting character. He comes off like this one-note evangelist, and a really annoying evangelist at that. And, you know, he doesn't really function well as sort of like an antagonist. He really just kind of goes around sort of brainwashing people, and he never goes in depth either about what he believes in. And if this wasn't enough, there's this whole Klingon subplot in the movie, like a bunch of Klingons who want to go after Captain Kirk for no discernible reason, and for me it's clear that they put this subplot here to make up for the lack of excitement in the rest of the movie, but it doesn't really help either because it feels so out of place and it feels like it's coming from a different movie. But perhaps one of the worst things about Final Frontier is the fact that the characters here just don't feel true to who they are, which is really baffling because in Voyage Home, which is more of a comedy than a sci-fi movie, those characters still felt like Captain Kirk and Spock and Bones. Here, they really just don't feel like that at all. You know, the first time you see Kirk, Spock, and Bones in this movie, Kirk is like climbing a mountain and Spock has like these hover boots on, and it just feels so strange because all this forced humor feels so out of line with their characters, and, you know, they're doing so much more physical stuff even when they're pretty old, so it just doesn't line up. The editing in this movie was done by Peter E. Berger, which is kind of baffling as well because he did the editing for Voyage Home, and here his editing is strangely misguided, though I wouldn't really blame him since he didn't have a lot to work with in the first place. But this is a really slow-paced and uneventful movie where nothing really happens until an hour into the movie. It really reminded me of Star Trek the Motion Picture, but without that movie's sense of discovery. Star Trek V really feels more like a Kirk and Spock film. It doesn't feel like an ensemble film anymore, and the editing doesn't really give us a chance to pay attention to the other crew members. And the actors also don't really seem to be playing their characters from before. William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley are exaggeratedly silly in this movie, and the other Enterprise crew barely have any screen time anyway to really make an impact. The thing about the previous Star Trek films that was kind of cool was the fact that the guest actors who played characters who weren't part of the original crew, like, they usually ended up being like the ace in the hole. They ended up being like really entertaining characters. Here, Lawrence Luckinbill, though, like, I didn't really buy his performance. I felt like he overcooked it a lot as Sybok, and again, just did not add any depth to this character, although, again, I wouldn't really blame him. But really, overall, he's just not a threatening presence. He's not a very intimidating person, and you can't really tell what his relationship is with any of the other characters. But by far, the worst actors in Star Trek V are these three actors who play ambassadors to Nimbus 3, this planet, and whenever whenever they say anything, it sounds like they're line reading so hard. And William Shatner as a director really just has zero ear for what made Star Trek 4 really funny. Instead, this movie really comes across as a bunch of old people trying to look funny or trying to look cool, but without the subtlety, the subtle humor that really makes the other Star Trek movies kind of funny in their own way. And when this movie isn't being like really kind of lame with its humor, it's being overly serious and pretentious with all this, talk about God and the universe. You have to earn that kind of stuff because it's really heady, and in this movie they don't earn it at all. And overall, Shatner's direction just doesn't have that sense of scale that was in the other Star Trek movies, and there's no sense of chemistry either among all the crew members. It just feels sort of like a vanity project sometimes. Even visually, Star Trek V takes a big step down. Andrew Lajlow's cinematography for this movie is curiously underlit, and when it's not underlit, it's saturated in these nauseating colors. There's one planet that they go down to, which is called Nimbus 3, and it has potential as well in its look, but it kind of ends up looking like a Mos Eisley ripoff or a Mad Max ripoff. It's pretty bland. And somehow the CGI in Star Trek The Motion Picture, which came out 10 years before this movie, looks better than any of the CGI in this movie. There's a big visual effects finale at the end of this movie that really looks like a TOS episode. And Star Trek V also features the most painful rendition of Row 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 Your Boat you will ever hear because of the context it's used in. It's just like, what were they thinking? Now again, on the positive side, this movie does feature the return of Jerry Goldsmith, whose score is instantly recognizable the second the movie starts. Like, when it started, I was like, this is Jerry Goldsmith, isn't it? And true enough, it was. And it does remain a notable element throughout the rest of the movie. And okay, fine, to William Shatner's credit as a director, he's not 100% terrible. He tries some fresh, interesting things with the action in this movie that had never really been done before in previous Star Trek films or episodes, and this stuff actually does kind of work sometimes. But overall, Star Trek V The Final Frontier really is just a bad movie. It really did almost kill the franchise, and you can really see it here. So if you're gonna, go back and watch like the old Star Trek movies, if you've never seen them before, I think you can skip Star Trek V. Just pretend it never happened. Alright, so those are my thoughts on Star Trek V The Final Frontier. If you guys have seen it, tell me what you thought about it, and whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.